we're on.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming out tonight. We're really excited to host Nick Walker for an intro to neuroqueering. And a couple of things. First, to let you know a little bit about the Spiritual Emergence and Other Extraordinary Experiences group here at CIS. We are a student alliance group that is here to support people in their awakening. Sometimes the way that that manifests is pathologized by the dominant paradigm and by Western allopathic medicine. So we're here to help provide an opportunity for education, peer support, and allowing people to really step back into the truth of their process. And in doing so, we are also allies and supporters of Nick and the work that neurodiversity movement is doing. And neuroqueering is really the cutting edge of this work. So Nick Walker has been an inspiration for me since I found out about the neurodiversity paradigm and neuroqueering. So I'm very excited that he's here to speak for us tonight. He's also definitely a person that I've been following over the years in really allowing what has been, considered the pathology paradigm to have another option. And we need that desperately in these times, and we need to call out the oppressive nature of the pathology paradigm and bring back the wisdom, the inner wisdom of neurodiversity and the way that that intersects with queerness, with all of our different types of diversity and social justice. So with that, I give you Nick Walker.
Thank you. Good evening. Thanks for coming. So let's start somewhere and see where it takes us. We're going to be, queering the form of the public presentation, among other things. So I'm not sticking to any script, and we'll see where this goes. At some point, there'll be time for questions, and we'll pass the microphone around, and then we'll see what else happens. I like that I can't see the clock from here, so is there one? There's not even a clock. Ooh, there's no clock anywhere that I can see. This is awesome. All right, this is good. So, who knows how long we'll be here. If you need to eat or
just
sleep.
have the little crystal pyramid there.
Yeah, if you need to eat or sleep, go for it. Step out into the bathroom, or take a sponge bath in the sink, whatever. Yeah, we'll be here till the sun rises, I think. All right, so let's start with defining some terms. The neurodiversity is a good place to start, but we're not going to stay there. We're going to go a lot weirder than that. So neurodiversity is the diversity of human minds and human brains. And when I say human minds, human brains, when we say, put in this neuro prefix, the prefix that implies the brain, we understand that this is shorthand because we reject this whole mind-body dualism idea. The brain is part of the body, and it's wired into the rest of the body. And the way that your body moves builds new neural pathways and shapes your brain, which in turn shapes your embodiment, which in turn shapes your brain, which in turn shapes your embodiment, which in turn shapes your brain. And so there's no there's no clear line between mind and body. It's a process of what the Buddhists call mutual co-arising. So neurodiversity sounds like we're just talking about brains, but we're talking about minds, about psyches, about bodies, individual bodies, and the cultural body, the cultural embodiment, what's going on with individual consciousness, what's going on with collective consciousness and the collective unconscious. All of that really figures into neurodiversity. So there's a lot packed into there, and that neuro is just shorthand. We're not brain separatists. That's neurodiversity. Now, neurodiversity paradigm. The neurodiversity paradigm is a term I coined some time back, and the neurodiversity paradigm is the idea, the framework, the perspective that neurodiversity is a form of diversity that follows similar patterns to gender diversity, diversity of sexual orientation, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, all those other forms of human diversity follow similar patterns. That's not an idea I came up with. It's kind of built into the term neurodiversity in a way. I coined the term neurodiversity paradigm back in 2012 in an effort to establish some clarity, because people were using the word neurodiversity to mean this paradigm, this perspective, but neurodiversity already has a meaning. It means the diversity of minds and brains. So I still see some people, saying things like neurodiversity is a perspective, or neurodiversity is the belief that blah, 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 blah. No, it isn't. Neurodiversity is not a perspective any more than cultural diversity or racial diversity are perspectives. They're biological or cultural facts. A neurodiversity paradigm is a particular way of looking at neurodiversity, regarding neurodiversity as a form of human diversity that behaves like other forms of human diversity in terms of its value as a creative resource for humanity, its value for the species, as any other form of biodiversity is valuable, as any other form of cultural diversity is valuable, as a source of innovation and creative synergy. And of course, neurodiversity also follows the same patterns as other forms of diversity, in that it is subject to the same forms of power dynamics, the same social dynamics of social inequality, the same dynamics of privilege and oppression and marginalization that other forms of neurodiversity, other forms of diversity are subject to. So we have the same patterns of social injustice that manifest around racism and sexism and all of that manifest around neurodiversity. Not exactly the same things, right? What happens, racism is different from sexism, racial minorities experience different oppressions from gender minorities, sexual orientation minorities, cultural minorities. These are all different on the surface, and yet the same patterns keep manifesting. And you look at the particular ways in which neurominorities, autistic people, or bipolar people, or dyslexic people, or schizophrenic people, various neurominorities, look at the ways in which they are marginalized, in which they are oppressed, in which they are silenced, and you'll see patterns the same as the patterns around racial oppression and gender oppression. And so the neurodiversity paradigm recognizes these patterns, recognizes neurodiversity as a form of diversity, and then there's the neurodiversity movement. The neurodiversity movement is a social justice movement, which sort of grew out of the autism rights movement and is spreading. And I'm doing my part to help it spread, and I see it as spreading right here in this school, in this community, spreading insofar as the concept is spreading and the neurodiversity activism is spreading, but also spreading in the sense of, again, the neurodiversity movement started with autistic people advocating for autistic rights, and has spread to other neurominorities. And so there's increasingly groups of dyslexic people who are adopting the neurodiversity paradigm. And then, as Michelle said in her introduction, you know, there are people who've been pathologized in other ways, bipolar people, schizophrenic people, who are starting to adopt the neurodiversity paradigm and say we are not damaged or defective or sick, especially we're not ill, we are neurodivergent and need to learn to work with our particular neurocognitive styles and ways of functioning. How do we work with them? Right, so the neurodiversity movement is spreading in that sense, and it is, again, a social justice movement that fights against people being oppressed by being pathologized, recognizes the dominant pathology paradigm that says if you're autistic or bipolar or dyslexic or schizophrenic, or you are broken and defective and bad. It takes, it challenges the pathology paradigm and says, no, we're minority groups. So, we need civil rights here, and what that looks like often is accommodation for who we are and how we function. And that's the neurodiversity movement. So we have all these things. We have the neurodiversity movement, which has a philosophy based in the neurodiversity paradigm, and that's great. I'm a big supporter of the neurodiversity movement, and we're not talking about it tonight. I mean, I just did, but I'm going to stop now. I've been looking at extensions. Where are the edges? Where does this lead is the question. So we have the neurodiversity paradigm, and the neurodiversity movement really is one obvious and essential extension of the neurodiversity paradigm, recognizing this as a valuable form of human diversity. We then say, well, heck, how about some civil rights, dude? So, yeah, neurodiversity paradigm, great. Where does it lead, is the question. Because I always have a concern, as a social justice activist, I have a concern around social justice movements, which is what's the end game? What's our vision? I'm not really into the eternal struggle thing. So the goal of any civil rights movement, even though it might take generations and generations, the goal of any civil rights movement should be to make itself obsolete, because at some point you get the rights. At some point it happens. At some point you actually get a world that recognizes you as fully human. And different groups, different minority groups are at different stages in the struggle. I mean, we're still fighting against racism in this country. That's an ongoing struggle still. We're still fighting homophobia and transphobia and sexism. All of that is still ongoing, but progress is happening for different groups too. You know, I mean, we are, I didn't imagine when I was a teenager that we would see, you know, legalized gay marriage, you know, and it's just a start. It's just, you know, and it's still an area of contention, but it was inconceivable 30 years ago. So something's happening. Things do get better, not on their own, but if we actively work to make them better. There is just more. There's more recognition. There's more acceptance of various sorts of diversity, certainly cultural diversity, going on in the world as a whole. And of course, we see, in current right-wing politics and such, a giant pushback against it. But it's important to recognize that it is a pushback against progress that's happening. It's important to recognize that the reason the right wing in America has gotten, overtly fascist and genocidal at this point is because they're desperate, because they're losing. So there is change happening, there is progress happening, even though it's slow. So social justice movements need some vision of an end game. I don't like the thing that happens, I see in social justice circles a lot, where, obviously we have to look at, this is what we're fighting. This is what we're fighting now. But sometimes social justice movements become completely focused on the negative. This is what we're fighting. Look at this terrible thing that's happening, and this terrible thing that's happening, and this terrible thing that's happening, and it burns people out. People get activist burnout. Why? Because it's essential also to have a positive vision. What are we working for? Not just what are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for? What's the end game, and how do we make it? When we get some slack, when we get a space where we're not actively being oppressed, what are we going to do in that space? How are we going to use it? What are you going to do with your equality when you get it? And why not do it right now, every time there's a little opportunity to do it? So, based on that, I'm looking beyond the neurodiversity movement as a civil rights movement, and I have this idea of neurocosmopolitanism, which is the name of my blog. And neurocosmopolitanism, cosmopolitanism, the idea of cosmopolitanism is, it's where multiculturalism goes. It's where you have this idea, the opposite of cosmopolitan is provincial. So the provincial perspective is you're raised in a particular culture, and to you, that's the one right culture. That's the one right way to do it. And everybody else is some weird foreigner who does things the weird, wrong way, right? I don't have an accent, everybody else does. I do things the normal way, and everybody else has exotic, quaint customs. That's the provincial perspective. The cosmopolitan perspective is the opposite of that, appreciating that each one of us has our own particular cultural background, really a unique cultural background in a way, because we have the broader cultures we're raised in, and then we have the microcultures of family and school and such that influence us, and it ends up with each person becoming a unique cultural synthesis. And recognizing and appreciating this and being able to navigate cultural diversity, being able to recognize that one's own cultural conditioning and cultural paradigms and cultural perspectives are just one among many, that is cosmopolitanism. And then from there being able to navigate and being able to synthesize, which we see, just learning other languages, or if you don't know other languages besides your own, just sort of appreciating whatever it is, the musics and rhythms of other cultures, and bringing them into your life, and the cuisines of other cultures other than yours, and just sort of this attitude of the diversity of human cultures is a bounty. It's a bounty of which we can all partake, not in the exploitive imperialist way of we are the great culture and we will steal what we want from other cultures, but more in the sense of mutual exchange, not colonialism, but cosmopolitanism. Different vibe, not exchanged by going and plundering, but exchanged by visiting and exchanging and communicating, which is really only possible when you come into it with an attitude of equality, because otherwise it becomes plunder very quickly. So that's cosmopolitanism. Neurocosmopolitanism, then, is the end game for neurodiversity paradigm and for the neurodiversity movement. It's taking the neurodiversity paradigm and having a cosmopolitan attitude towards all of the diversity of human minds out there, appreciating just, wow, every human being is this unique, extraordinary universe of consciousness, an embodied consciousness, completely alien to my own, and no better or worse, or, there's no hierarchy of what's the right way for a person to function, or, what's normal, what's sane. There's just, wow, let me grok your consciousness. Let's exchange, like, what's your reality like? Whoa, I like how you move. What if I move that way? What does that do to my mind? Ooh, wow. All right, and start playing with it, being able to speak to people whose consciousness is vastly different from yours, being a neurotypical person or an autistic person, and going and speaking to schizophrenic people and not having that superior attitude of, oh, I can do reality testing and you can't, but instead, wow, you're tuned into a whole different part of the collective unconscious from me, and we're going to learn each other's languages now because, this is interesting. This is where learning happens, is our minds are different. And, or just sort of accepting, okay, my dinner companion here has particular sensory and embodiment needs, and I need to accommodate those as a good host or a good companion, and I'll communicate what my particular needs are so they can accommodate mine, and we'll both learn something that way. And so that's the neurocosmopolitan attitude there. The next thing is neuroqueering. And I hear there's going to be a talk about that tonight. So, neurodiversity, diversity of human minds, human brains as they are embodied, and neurodiversity paradigm, looking at this in terms of human diversity and the dynamics of human diversity, neurocosmopolitanism, having this cosmopolitan attitude towards neurodiversity, and enjoying and partaking of and artfully, gracefully navigating the neurodiversity of the world and of our communities and our families. Neuroqueering. Neuroqueering is where we increase neurodiversity, where we are not content to merely fight for equality for neurominorities. We want that, but we don't stop there. We're not content to merely enjoy the neurodiversity of the species, but also, how do we make it weirder? How do we make the species even weirder? If neurodiversity is good, well, heck, let's have more of it. If our own neurodivergence, the unique beauty of our own consciousness, is worth honoring, is it not also worth enhancing? Is it not also worth not just honoring, not just accepting, not just celebrating, but exploring all the way, exploring its full potential? not just accepting, oh, okay, I am weird, and I'm cool with that, and I'm gonna live that. I'm gonna be that, and I'm gonna demand that I be treated as fully human, despite my weirdness or in all my weirdness. Not just that, but let's see where this weirdness goes. Let's crank it up and see what this weird baby can do. So, that's neuroqueering, in short. But this is a long talk, so we're not going to do it in short. We're going to do neuroqueering in long and get into some detail here. Now, let's talk about the word queer. Well, the word queer originally, way back in the old days, meant not straight. And this is interesting because, of course, now in the context of gender and sexual orientation, queer means not straight, right? Straight means like heteronormative, and queer is not straight. We are not conforming to the heteronormative. But interestingly, queer meant not straight. Queer and straight were opposites before it had any gender or sexual connotation. So queer was like tangled or perpendicular to. You know, fishermen would talk about the fishing lines getting queered, which means they got all tangled and askew and such, or caught on something. And then there is, just queer as in odd or strange, but often just like, this is a queer, a queer street. It like isn't part of the grid of streets. There's this whole, and then in like the early 20th century, you still see this if you watch old film noir movies. Being straight with someone meant being honest with them, and so if you were queer with someone, it meant you were lying to them. You're conning them. So this is still like showing up as the opposite of straight. So then we get queer meaning weird, right? Non-normal, defying norms. And initially, when queer enters the language of sexual orientation and gender and such, queer is a slur. Queer started out, when it first started getting used to talk about gay or gender non-conforming people, queer was a hateful slur associated with gender violence. And so it was, it's a reclaimed word. It's a word that the LGBTQ community fought to reclaimed as part of queer pride, gay pride, part of claiming a social identity. And and there are, I remember it being a slur. I'm old enough. I'm not that old, I hope, but I'm old enough to remember it being entirely a slur. And it's really it's like in the 80s that the communities, various gay queer communities started to reclaim the word queer as an identity label. So I like reclaimed words. There's a power in reclaiming them and taking them back, saying, this is ours now. And now we will use it. Hey, this is, I'm a big fan, I teach Aikido, which I may talk more about later tonight. I don't know where this is going, but but I teach Aikido, and we have this thing we do where somebody grabs us or strikes us, we will blend and move with them and take maybe the arm that they tried to grab us or strike us with and move it somewhere else, and in some interesting trajectory that ends with the attacker on the ground. And so I always think of that when I think of reclaiming words. I think of, okay, use this arm against me, and now it's mine, and I'm going to use it. Haha. So I love reclaimed words as cultural Aikido. So, so I'm a fan of this word queer and the power of owning it as a reclaimed word. The term neuroqueer was coined simultaneously by three people, actually. I'm one of them. And then the other two are Ibby Grace. All three of us are autistic, by the way. Ibby Grace is an autistic scholar in Chicago, and she is a lesbian and about my age, and was very heavily involved in gay rights activism in the 80s and the early 90s. You know, I mean, in like the 80s through like the Reagan era and the era of AIDS. I mean, that was a hardcore, a brutal time for the gay communities and gay rights movement. And so she was one of those, frontline hardcore activist people there. So she was one of the people who, she was part of the community of warriors who took back the word queer, who did the act, who were involved in the act of reclaiming it. So she's very entitled to use the term now as she sees fit. And her conception of neuroqueer, where she started using the word neuroqueer, she was getting involved in the neurodiversity movement and exploring her identity as an autistic person, and she started seeing how all of her queer activism, all of the work she'd done in the lesbian community, how that applied to her neurodiversity activism, and how it applied also to her self-concept, how there was this empowering thing, because she's like many queer people, raised in this environment of intense shame, where queer people are deeply shamed and attacked for not conforming to the heteronormative models, and so there's a reclaiming of self. There's like, no, screw that, I'm okay, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm queer, and it's awesome. And that's this self-empowerment as well as activism, culturally, and activism socially. There's also the inner activism one does, fighting to get rid of the internalized oppression. And so what she saw was in fighting to get rid of her internalized oppression as an autistic person, she was running into exactly the same patterns and exactly the same struggles that she ran into fighting for self-empowerment and fighting her internalized oppression as a queer person. And so she started using the term neuroqueer in that sense, in the sense of applying queer theory and queer liberation ideas to the realm of neurodiversity. That was her entry point into the concept of neuroqueer. The third person who also came up with the term at the very same time, just concurrently, was Michael Scott Manji. And by the way, we have a a table of books back there for sale for afterwards, and you'll see that there is Michael Scott Manji's novel Defiant back there, which Brent is holding up right now, and also a book Typed Words, Loud Voices, which A.B. Grace co-edited, and then there's the Real Experts, Readings for Parents of Autistic Children, which is not directly relevant to Neuroqueer, but which actually has writing by me and Ivy and Michael in it. So, anyway, Michael is an autistic trans woman, and her entry point into the concept of neuroqueer was a little different from Ivy's. Her entry point into the concept of neuroqueer was looking at how her neurodivergence, she's multiply neurodivergent. She's autistic and multiple personality. And so Michael was looking at how her neurodivergence actively intersected her queerness, her gender queerness, and her being a trans woman. So for her, they were not separable, because she was having this experience of being autistic and being trans were intimately entwined. The oppression she experienced, the abuse she experienced as a child around not conforming to various norms, it was inseparable. Couldn't draw the line what's about autism and what's about queerness. And then, of course, you know, as a multiple personality, with both male and female personalities, and the female personalities being like, hey, you know, we want to do the female body thing. And I'm probably oversimplifying here, because Michael's whole neurology and sexuality is beautifully complex and intricate, and that is why her experience was, oh, this is completely inseparable. I can't say, oh, I am over here neurodivergent and autistic, and you know, and multiple personality, you know, and oh, and by the way, I'm also trans, because they don't separate. It's one big person. You know, Mike actually refers to herself as a puzzle box. It's the puzzle box collective. So there's that whole human puzzle box thing, and you can't separate out what are the issues around gender queerness and sexual orientation queerness, and what is it around what's the neurodivergence. And so for Michael, it was essential in just understanding herself to have this term neuroqueer to describe the whole picture, that they're not separable. So that was another take on neuroqueerness. And my own take on the subject was you know, also autistic, and I'll talk maybe a little more about my own particular journey later, but I was genderqueer from like very early. I was a gender non-conforming child, like way right from the start, and super far back as I can remember, way before I had any kind of words or language for it or understood what was going on. And then of course I was also, you know, was and am autistic also. And I found the two also inseparable in terms of how people dealt with me, and in terms of the violence I encountered in my upbringing. the embodiment of the two, I can't draw a line. Again, I can't draw a clear line between what it means to have a neurodivergent autistic embodiment and what it means to have a genderqueer embodiment. That I don't move like other people. I don't perform normal. I don't perform gender or neurology in a normative way. So, now I experienced a lot of bullying and violence when I was young, and starting with just being a victim of it, and then just fighting back a whole lot, and so just fighting a lot throughout my childhood and throughout my adolescence and growing up. The experience I had there of being targeted for having a divergent style of embodiment was I heard the slur queer a lot. That I was attacked for being queer a lot, and that looking back, it was sometimes maybe about gender nonconformity, but it was largely about autistic ways of moving and the fact that that wasn't distinguishable to other kids. There was no distinction. They saw unusual styles of embodiment, and it set off their must defend heteronormativity alerts. So again, the term neuroqueering suggested itself to me, but also for me, I've been involved since early adolescence, really actively engaged in transformative spiritual practices, holistic mind-body transformative practices, martial arts and meditation, and transformative physical theater techniques, all about transforming my consciousness and psychedelics use, looking for exploring the potentials of my brain and playing with them. And to me, that was an essential part of neuroqueering, was this idea not just neuroqueer as a noun, but neuroqueering as a verb of queering the brain, changing the brain, actively becoming more of a mutant. And so I brought that idea into it. And so the three of us, Ibby and Michael and me, came together around that idea, around this term neuroqueer that we all came to independently. And we just, it was a few years after we were all playing privately with the term and planning to use it someday, and there was this just online discussion that the three of us were in, where it came out. My blog, which is called Neurocosmopolitanism, I almost called it Neuroqueer. So I mentioned my blog was almost called Neuroqueer. It was kind of a last-minute decision which one to go with. And Michael's book back there, Defiant, was almost entitled Neuroqueer. And he made a last-minute decision not to, right around the same time that I was deciding on the name for my blog. And then Ivy had been tossing around the idea in her own scholarship, and like, what am I going to write about this term? How am I going to bust it out? And so we just decided to bust it out together. The three of us are part of the team of people who co-founded Autonomous Press, which is all the books back there on the table are Autonomous Press books. Autonomous Press is an independent publishing company. It's a worker-owned collective, entirely owned and operated by neurodivergent people, mostly queer neurodivergent people. And we're dedicated to publishing books about that stuff. So There's 4 out so far, and they're on the table back there, and there are more exciting ones coming soon. But anyway, that's the origins of the term neuroqueer, and what we're looking to do with the term is really keep it as broad and inclusive as possible. We wanted this to be inclusive, and that's a departure that some people who have encountered the term have had trouble wrapping their minds around, because there is an unfortunate tendency in social justice activism circles to draw a lot of battle lines and say, okay, we're all autistic people over here, and we're all gay people over here, and we're all this or that marginalized group, and you have no idea what our oppression is like, and keep out, go away, and there's that constant defending of the boundaries. You can't use this term because it's part of our struggle, and we don't want you appropriating it. And I respect that that's sometimes necessary, because stuff gets appropriated. Stuff gets appropriated from marginalized groups and by the dominant culture, and that further marginalizes those groups, and that's not good. So I get why that sort of boundary policing becomes necessary in certain circumstances. It's sad that it's necessary, but it is necessary. And I respect people holding those boundaries. That's not what we wanted to do with Neuroqueer, though. Because with Neuroqueer, we really wanted it to be, to build the idea of everyone having the opportunity to explore their own queerness. Because everybody is potentially queer. I mean, there are normal people, sure, we say there are normal people, members of the dominant culture, neurotypical, white, straight, and all that, but that can be cured. Anyone who appears normal is just another mutant freak who hasn't yet found the zipper on their normal costume. So neuroqueering is about finding that zipper and getting out of that normal suit, because it's uncomfortable in there. They're really stiff. So initially, when we started going public with this concept of neuroqueer and neuroqueering, we ran into this question of Ibby is saying neuroqueering is about, we're coming with an umbrella definition that includes a lot of different things, includes all of the different definitions that we brought to it. So we have, but if Ibby is saying, that neuroqueering is about applying the lessons of queer struggles and queer theory and queer liberation to neurodiversity, and if I'm saying that anybody can queer their brains and queer their embodiment, a dicey issue comes up, which is it okay, given that lesbian, gay, transgender, queer, genderqueer people fought so hard to reclaim this term that was used against them, is it okay to use it in a way that can include people who are not queer in a sexual gender way? That's a tough question, because there are these issues of appropriation and these issues of people struggled really hard to reclaim that term. People, fought and died over that term, and it is a term that reclaiming it, when it's as a reclaimed term, it's a trophy that's dripping blood. So, is that okay? I have two answers to that, and I'll start with one, and we'll see if I get around to the other one, because I'm unpredictable that way. But the first answer, what I discovered when I started exploring neuroqueering, when I started really playing with exploring the edges of how I was embodying my neurology as an autistic person and such, I discovered what I should have learned back in childhood if I'd had the vocabulary for it and such, and what Michael had been saying all along, which is that ultimately neurodivergence and divergence from heteronormativity are inseparable. That if you push the neuroqueering far enough, if you weren't genderqueer already, you're gonna be. Because heteronormativity, the demand, the cultural, social demand that we all embody specific binary heterosexual gender roles. Heteronormativity is totally pervasive. It is the binary heterosexual gender roles that patriarchy and heteronormativity attempt to impose on all of us are absolutely restrictive. They are impossible ideals. And that's part of how patriarchy works, is that people are kept in a constant state of anxiety because they're ideals that can't be lived up to. So there's this extreme rigidity and restrictiveness of what it means to behave in a masculine fashion, or what it means to behave in a feminine fashion according to the heteronormative standards. And those standards shift and evolve over time. But the dominant heteronormative standards, whatever they are at the time, they are absolutely restrictive and absolutely impossible in how demanding they are. And that's how patriarchy and gender oppression work. That men, or people who are labeled at birth as male, are pushed to spend their entire lives trying to live up to an impossible repressive form of masculinity. And women, or people who are labeled as female at birth, are pushed to spend their entire lives trying to live up to an impossible idea of femininity. And people are kept in a constant state of anxiety. And if they deviate too far, which is not very far at all really, from gender norms, they are immediately attacked for it, because everyone around them is also in a constant state of terror about not living up to gender roles. And so you are immediately playing out everybody's feared and hated shadow if you deviate from gender roles, because everyone is desperately trying to repress their tendency to deviate from these roles that really nobody can or should live up to. Because of that, to be weird is to deviate from heteronormativity, if you're weird in any way, because heteronormativity is so pervasive. Because it tells you every single thing that there's right ways, and people are told this from very early childhood. In this culture, there's right ways to move like a man or to move like a woman, to dress like a man or dress like a woman, to talk like a man or talk like a woman, right ways you have to respond and embody yourself in any given situation. And heteronormativity is also neuronormativity, because heteronormativity places absolute, pervasive, rigid standards on exactly how you can move and embody yourself as a human being. And neuronormativity, normativity of neurological, neurocognitive function, normativity of consciousness, neurotypicality, that is also an absolute rigid standard of embodiment, where if a child these days starts moving in ways that don't look like their peers, they're immediately taken and assessed for autism and ADHD and whatever, and forcibly medicated or subjected to behaviorist torture or whatever. So, because these standards are so rigid and absolute, you can't deviate from one without deviating from the other. If you start moving like an autistic person, you are necessarily also deviating from conventional masculine or feminine ways of moving. Which is why, as a child, moving like an autistic person got me attacked for being gay all the time. I was also gender nonconforming, and looking back, that's inseparable from being autistic. Autistic people tend, on the whole, to be very prone to being gender nonconforming. Neurodivergent people in general, I'm most familiar with the autistic community as a member of it, but my wife is bipolar, and I'm getting to know more bipolar people and people otherwise neurodivergent, as you know, just through doing the work I do, and they're all gender nonconforming in some way or another, or would be if they allowed themselves to play out their neurology in ways that they've been trained not to. Of necessity, if your neurological wiring means that gives you a different way from the majority of embodying your humanity, that's also going to deviate from heteronormative ways, because there's nothing that heteronormativity doesn't intrude into in the society. So, in the end, after embarrassing myself a little bit by saying, look, we should let people use the term neuroqueer to describe themselves, whether they're gender queer or not, I had to admit, based on my own experience and all the experience of the people I was watching and talking to, oh, you really can't separate them anyway. You start exploring what your neurology can do enough. You start getting deep enough into it, and you start finding your gender queerness anyway. You start finding, if you keep following, like, how do I follow my, the needs of my brain? How do I follow the potentials of my mind, of my consciousness, of my brain, of my embodiment? How do I follow it and really pursue my unique birthright of bizarre individuality? Sooner or later, you're in defiance of the heteronormativity police. Sooner or later, you're starting to discover your queerness and starting to discover, oh, okay, now that I've like shed the basic restrictions of how I move, now I've given myself permission to move how I like and want what I want and such, oh, suddenly, wow, I'm realizing how restrictive this straight man suit is, or this straight woman suit is. Oh my God, I don't want to be that. That's keeping me from moving the way I want to move. Just like trying to act Like I am not autistic or not bipolar or whatever is keeping me from moving the way I want to move. So they become inseparable. The other reason, I did get to it, look at that. The other reason that I'm cool with the use of neuroqueer and with that particular, clear with, the other reason that I'm cool with using the term queer in that particular way, again, the three of us who came up with the word are all queer in our own ways. We're a lesbian and a trans woman and genderqueer me. And all of us have experienced a great deal of violence, of gender violence in our lives because of our queerness. And so all of us are among the many people who have participated in fighting to reclaim the word queer, who've been targeted with it, and then reclaimed it for ourselves as part of claiming, yes, this is who we are. So we have as much claim on the word as anyone else. As much claim on the word queer as anyone else who fought for it, who was targeted with it. So the question, having fought to reclaim it, having fought to own that word, what are we going to do with it? What do we do with it? And I can think if one takes a tool of oppression, whatever it is, if one takes a weapon of oppression back from the oppressors, whether it's a word or something else, what better thing is there to do with it than use it to aid in the liberation of other people? So, having reclaimed this word, I think we should use it, if we can, to help with anyone's liberation. I mean, I know, and the people who have been enthusiastic about the term neuroqueer include most of the queer theory, gender studies scholars I know, because they get that. This is why you do the work. This is why you do the work of queer theory. This is why you do the work of liberation in theory and in practice, to liberate everybody. So I mean, black scholars who do critical race theory are thrilled when they hear from me that something they came up with in the realm of critical race theory has been of use to the neurodiversity movement, the neurodiversity paradigm, and neurodiversity scholarship. It's like, oh, cool. This is helping liberate not only our group, but your group too? Yeah. Stick it to the man. Yeah. And so, same thing with queer theory, right? If we can use this idea, queer theory has these beautiful ideas about how gender is performative and how we all become trapped in these socially imposed gender performances. If we can take that idea and apply it to neurodiversity and how neurotypicality is also performative, and how we're all pushed to perform neurotypicality against the promptings of our own natural neurology, great. If we can use queer theory for that, and if we can use the word queer theory if we can use the word queer, if we can use the word queer and the concept of queering in the fight towards a neurocosmopolitan world, and the fight towards liberation from neuronormativity as well as heteronormativity, yeah, let's do it. I am totally fine, while I think that if anyone pushes the liberation of their neurological tendencies far enough, they're going to get genderqueer. They're going to start busting out of gender norms enough that they're legitimately genderqueer. While I believe this, and kind of hope it, I am fine with that not being the case. I am fine with people using the term neuroqueer, liberating themselves neurologically, liberating their embodiment of their neurologies, and still ending up being gender conforming and heterosexual and such, and still using the term neuroqueer. I think that's totally fine, because I think that that's still legitimate use. It's still using the word queer as a term, as a tool of liberation. Again, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's possible to really liberate one's full potential for neurological weirdness and remain within the confines of heteronormativity. One may be heterosexual still, but one is going to be genderqueer because those gender norms are so restrictive, because they restrict your embodiment. If you liberate your embodiment from neuronormativity, you end up liberating it from heteronormativity. So that's my reasoning and why I'm enthusiastically in favor of the term neuroqueering really being available for anyone's use, because what I want to do is encourage the practice of it. I want to encourage the practice of neuroqueering. What does that look like? What does the practice of neuroqueering look like? I mean, God, we should cover that, shouldn't we? That's important, right? Neuroqueering. Neuroqueering is a process, again, of liberating yourself from neuronormative and heteronormative styles of cognition, imposed performances of cognition and consciousness and embodiment, liberating the psyche and liberating the way the psyche is embodied. And again, we work with the fact that there is a feedback loop, a co-arising going on between the psyche and the body at all time. The field of somatic psychology, we say the psyche is somatically organized. So when heteronormative and neuronormative embodiments are imposed on people, when little kids are assigned, you're going to be a little girl and grow up into a woman, you're going to be a little boy and grow up to a man, and when those roles are imposed, and then it's like, no, girls don't do that, no, boys don't do that, you're restricting, imposing restrictions on people's embodiment, on how they express their potentials. And at the same time, there's also be normal. Not just little girls have to act like little girls and wear dresses and not spit and not climb trees and all that, and little boys don't play with dolls, they play with trucks and guns, and boys don't cry, and all that. In addition to that, there is the neuronormative, increasingly imposed on people. Just don't be weird, right? Don't move your hands like that. What are you, autistic? Don't move your hands like that, and make eye contact exactly this amount, because this is how we do it here, and this is of course this the texture of this clothing or the lighting in this room can't bother you. That's not normal. I'm fine with it. Why aren't you? Man up, kid. So there's the stay in your seat. Sit up straight. Don't sit like that. Don't move like that. Right? That's imposed too. And it's all imposed together on people's embodiment. And when you restrict, when you train children, as the society does, to restrict their embodiment and to pass for heteronormative and neuronormative, to pass for normal little boys and normal little girls. You restrict the development of the psyche. You restrict the development of the full potential of the consciousness, because how is our consciousness developed? How is our consciousness developed? It's developed by exploring with the body. As babies, starting from babyhood, that's what we do. We explore the world with our senses, with our bodies. It's a full body process. Babies are like totally embodied, reaching out for everything, playing with everything. It's all play and embodiment, and all they move in whatever way it takes to learn and discover, and they're following this sort of built-in imperative to process the world and expand the brain and fulfill the brain's potentials and the potentials of their psyche. And that process gets cut off by cultural restrictions on ways you're allowed to move and ways you're allowed to be. And people get locked in and they lose capacity for certain feelings and for doing certain things, for embodying themselves in certain ways. And that's, there's restrictions, on what you can do with your senses. We're trained to be super visual and auditory in this culture and not to explore things so much with our hands or our whole bodies or by rubbing up against them and sniffing them and tasting them, right? We're restricted to a very narrow range of sensory experience and told you have to keep your attention on certain things and not notice all this other stuff. And we're restricted from, there's different ways of moving. Gives access to different kinds of consciousness and different cognitive capacities, different levels of consciousness. And if we're restricted in how we're allowed to move, we're restricted from accessing those forms of consciousness. Restricted from accessing certain kinds of feelings, certain kinds of emotion, right? And then girls are trained to submissiveness, to submissive postures and ways of embodiment. The asserting of personal boundaries, the owning of space is an embodied process. And girls are trained not to be able to do that in the society. And boys are trained that they have to occupy all the space possible all of the time. which sounds like they get a better deal, but it actually restricts, cuts off their capacities for tenderness and for receiving and giving nurturance and such. So it really sucks for everybody. So there's all of these are natural capacities that people are cut off from developing. People are cut off from reaching their full potentials. And so neuroqueering really is about becoming shapeshifters. It is about being able to access a broader range of what you can do, a broader range of what you can embody and of what your consciousness can do, a broader range of your natural potentials as whatever you are, as, an autistic person or a bipolar person or a schizophrenic person or a person who is not any particular neurodivergent style. You may be born perfectly neurotypical, but if you explore your capacity for movement enough, you won't be anymore. It's about being able to fully explore your capacity for performance of gender. Inevitably, again, one becomes genderqueer if one fully explores one's capacity to perform not just a single gender role, but to perform a full range of activities that society has imposed gender on. But if we just refuse to acknowledge them as gendered activities and start saying, I'm going to wear what I want and move how I want and love how I want, eventually we start getting into queer realms because we get so far outside of imposed heteronormative embodiment. And we queer ourselves. And we neuroqueer ourselves because we change gender performance, or we change performance of consciousness and of being an embodied psyche in a human body, we change the performance enough, we change our brains and make them very unusual indeed, make them neuroqueer, as we tend to make our gender performances queer. And I do see this, I'm really actively exploring this in my Aikido practice these days. I've been doing Aikido since I was 12. That's 35 years now. And I've become very interested in it, in Aikido practice as neuroqueering and as an antidote to patriarchy and heteronormativity. I got clued into this initially some time ago by a fellow Aikido teacher named Wendy Palmer, who's written a couple of interesting books on Aikido and embodiment. And what she said was that, and she's not a queer theory person or queer or, she's neurotypical as far as I know, but what she said that got me thinking was that all of the really advanced Aikido practitioners she knows have somehow become androgynous through their practice. And I thought about that and I was like, oh, yeah, because what are we doing? We're learning new ways of embodiment, and heteronormative roles are all about this imposed hierarchy of women are trained to this submissive, boundaryless embodiment, and men are trained to this take up lots of space, blustering, macho embodiment. And there's different hierarchies, there's like the men who are trained to be, really, dominant and take up more space, and then, underlings who are trained to be lower in the hierarchy and to pull themselves in more. And there's all this hierarchical embodiment stuff imposed. Aikido's about subverting that. It's this practice, as a martial arts practice that deals with territory. As a martial art, it deals with territory and conflict and how we deal with fear and aggression in ourselves and other people. And so this means men come into Aikido and they come in full of macho and wanting to muscle people around, and we start training them out of those heteronormative roles into how do you get softer so you can feel more. And women come in, we're like training them, how do you get bigger? How do you take up more space? How do you have boundaries? And of course, it's not always divided on gender lines at all. Everybody's learning that. But what happens in the end is that, at least in terms of how people embody their roles in hierarchy and roles in conflict, people over long term of practice start transcending embodied gender hierarchy roles. And so I'm very interested now in really enhancing and exaggerating that and being like, yeah, okay, this is a tool of liberation from heteronormativity. And and also an opportunity for me to wear a skirt to work. So there's, I'm just looking at that in all things. I'll talk a little bit about, personally, I had this experience of being, autistic and also genderqueer as a child, and being targeted for that a lot. And I didn't have the vocabulary for the genderqueerness very much at the time. Or the autism, I just knew I was weird, and I was cool with that, but other people weren't. Over time, I stayed weird, but also looked for ways to protect myself in a world that was unsafe for me. and so for a while, eventually, I stayed. I experimented. I really played with my gender presentation a lot through my adolescence, and then in my 20s, eventually, I really just for sort of a sense of safety and how do I leverage what little privilege, what little advantage I have in this world as a disabled person living in poverty and struggling with homelessness and stuff. What's the safest embodiment for me? I started just really discovering that I could embody a very traditional looking male exterior, a traditional heteronormative male exterior. So I started doing that in a big way and really doing the whole, like, I got really muscular in my 20s and was very, very totally embodied that whole macho thing in how I lived, how I embodied myself. Looking back, I do not like what it did to my consciousness. It messed me up, and it made me a very unpleasant person to be around, including for me as well as for other people. And it's terrifyingly easy to get stuck in because it works. You know, I mean, it was like, oh, wow, okay, all I have to do is be muscular and stiff and, play this awful man role in how I embody myself, and suddenly, instead of being targeted for being queer, I have male privilege. It's very tempting, but it's a deal with the devil. And so I did that for a while. It made me miserable, and of course, tied in with that, just moving that way also meant moving less autistically because, again, neuronormativity and heteronormativity are inextricably intertwined. I'm so impressed I managed to say inextricably intertwined. It's a great phrase. When I was in my late 20s, I had a near-death experience, and it prompted me that and a series of interesting synchronicities led me to working with an experimental theater director named Antero Ali. Some of you may be familiar with his work on the Eighth Circuit model of consciousness, or his independent film work. But he was very interesting. I'd read some of his books when I was much younger, and so the opportunity arose to work with him in his group Paratheatrical Research, which operated in Berkeley for about 20 years, from 1996 until just very recently when he moved up to Portland and shifted that work there. So for 20 years I worked with him very intensively in this physical theater medium, which is about not performance-oriented per se, though except in terms of maybe exploring things like gender performance and such like that, and that sort of thing. At least I use it that way, but it's a term, it's a tool, it's a technology of using physical theater and movement, dance and sound techniques to explore, really to explore the unconscious, the personal and collective unconscious and its contents, to explore the shadow realm and the archetypal realm and such through the realm of archetypes, through embodiment. And so I doing that work really intensively. Doing Jungian work of accessing the unconscious, but it's not cerebral. It's totally embody, move, bring it into your embodiment. And it's the most powerful liberatory work I've ever experienced. I actually have a plan to start facilitating it now that Antero is not in town anymore, to start facilitating it sometime in a year or so, as my schedule allows. So stay tuned for more on that. But when I started working with that, what happened was I started recovering my ability to move like an autistic person. I started tapping into old childhood styles of movement that I'd been lost in my unsafe environment and heteronormativity and such. I started first recovering autistic ways of moving, and that blew my consciousness wide open, because suddenly I had access to all of the cool things that my autistic brain could do that I had lost, that I'd forgotten I ever had. But oh, whoa, there it is, surfacing along with childhood memories and stuff, childhood ways of moving and childhood abilities and stuff my autistic brain could do, potentials that had been cut off because it had been unsafe for me, as it is for most children, to explore the full weirdness of my embodiment. And I mean, that's why I am a scholar and doctoral student and college faculty member today, because my brain couldn't do that stuff. It was 15 years between when I barely scraped out of high school and when I started going to college, because my brain couldn't do that stuff without accessing the full capacities of my consciousness. So I had to change how I moved in order to be able to think well enough to do academia well. And then I had to find a school where I could do academia the way my brain worked. And yeah, that's here. I have a goal to turn the school into a neuroqueer mecca where all the weird people can come and study and in their own unique, queer, neurodivergent ways. So that started happening. I started reclaiming autistic ways of moving and getting weirder and just rediscovering all these abilities, and also processing all the rage and grief over having cut this stuff off. It was very intense work for a very long time. At some point, this is delving into the Jungian shadow realm, because the embodiment styles and potentials that we suppress become our shadow. I'm going to step over here and have a drink. Thank you. If you know your Jung, of course, you go through the shadow realm, and eventually you get to the realm of the anima or animus, which is all of the basically all of the power that you lose access to, all of the wisdom and power that you lose access to because of the gender roles that have been imposed on you. So if you've had masculine heteronormative gender roles imposed on you, there's the anima, and if you feminine roles, and the animus, these aspects of yourself, the masculine or feminine, that are cut off from, and then you're forced to project them outward and look for them in romantic partners and such, and that never works. This anima, or there's a reclaiming the shadow work, and then there's this reclaiming of the anima or animus, reclaiming of all of the lost potential for gender expression and gender performance, and all of the power and wisdom that came with that we've been cut off from by having heteronormative embodiment imposed on us. So I started doing anima work in this paratheater work, and I'm still engaged in that work, and still integrating work that I've done over the last several years, and the integration of all of the FAMA stuff that I cut off when I allowed myself to get heteronormative. It's a powerful work, a powerful work of queering myself, which I highly recommend. And again, this starts with how we move, how we embody ourselves, and you start changing how you move and how you embody yourself, and start doing things that are different, that have been taboo, and you start building new neural pathways, and you start running up against resistances and internalized oppressions and internalized rigidities, very embodied, what Wilhelm Reich calls character armor, like the chronic muscular rigidities that we don't even feel anymore, we don't even know we have. Not like muscle tension, like tight shoulders from working hard, but like deep stuff that's cutting off our feeling that we don't know we have, that's really locked in there and holding so much of our energy that we can liberate. And it does amazing things to the consciousness when we do. And so we have these concepts, the Jungian reclaiming the shadow and the anima, and Reich's idea of de-armoring, and all of these for me are integral to the concept of neuroqueering. Neuroqueering is really just applying this very intentionally to liberating ourselves from neuronormativity and heteronormativity, and that is what I'm talking about. This is a school that we're in right now. This is a school building, and I am a professor here. So I'm going to give you all homework. Then we'll do questions and answers and such. But your homework is to play with how you move. Go home and play with how you move, and particularly look for what you're not allowed to do.